I once saw a speaker who used the illustration of dancing to identify the unconscious choices people often make when they are entering into romantic relationships. If raised in a home where our parents were relatively healthy, we learned a dance posture that was relatively upright. If raised in a somewhat dysfunctional home, then our dance posture might be just a little wonky. But if we were raised in an injuriously dysfunctional home, our dancing posture may have become contorted and bent over. So if we learned our relationship dance based on our home life growing up, what happens then when we ask someone to dance with us? Well, if that person dances in an upright posture and we've only learned to dance bent over, we'll be uncomfortable. In fact, we might ask, where did that person learn to dance like that? And so we try out various dance partners until we find someone who dances in the same posture we learned in our childhood homes. And the important thing is to identify what in our lives makes us dance in the posture that we do. Most of us, by the time that we're old enough to have a relationship, have experienced some things that cause us to be bent over more or less. Maybe it was a workaholic father who could never say, "I love you." Maybe it was an overbearing and demanding mother who could never offer a word of affirmation no matter how hard you tried. Or maybe it was parents who would be arguing and yelling late into the night when you were lying in bed, hoping that sleep might come. Have you ever heard someone who says, "Yes, my childhood was bad, but I've moved on"? Or, "Well, I can't do anything about what happened back then, so I just don't let it affect me now"? In my experience, people who say such things are often the most obviously bent over. And how I wish I could offer some sort of healing that might help them stand upright, like Jesus does in this story that's told in Luke 13. Now, I usually imagine the bent-over woman in this story as elderly, but I recall in high school that there was a girl with a severe arthritic condition. Just 16 years old, her arms and legs were hopelessly twisted. And so perhaps this bent-over woman isn't all that old, maybe late 20s or something like that. But just like that girl that I remember from high school, it was her condition, not her name, that was used to identify her and set her apart. I am embarrassed to say that I have no recollection of what her name was, just her condition. The Greek word that Luke uses to describe this woman's condition is not just bent. It means bent together. And the picture that Luke is painting is of a woman who is bent in on herself, suffering not just from a physical infirmity. The implication is that she is plagued with a spirit of infirmity. Whatever it is that has bent her over, the woman has herself bought into it, and it defines her. And after 18 years suffering from this condition, she's a hopeless case. Do you know people like this? People who seem to be stuck as if inside a box that contorts them. If they could just catch a break. If they could escape whatever armpit of a town they're stuck in. Or if they could just get the right job. Or meet the right guy. Then everything would be fine. And every town, every job, and every relationship ends in that same twisted box. Have you known people trapped in that type of cycle? And we too can get into twisted cycles, can't we? So Luke wants us to know that this woman's handicap is more than a physical limitation. It is spiritual. And anyone who has suffered from a severe neck or back pain or any severe illness knows how quickly that physical illness affects the intellectual, the physical and spiritual parts of our lives. There's a spiritual limitation that also affects the synagogue leader in our reading this morning. As much as the crippled woman, the ruler of the synagogue is under a crippling spirit. The ruler is bent out of shape. The word Luke uses is indignant. By the rules of the Sabbath, which Jesus has taken liberty. He is bound up by the rules and regulations and how things must be done properly. His attitude reminds me of a young girl that was in a church I once served, and she was in worship that morning, and she was happily drawing. She was using the attendance pad as a sort of support to draw on her paper. And the woman next to her, not a relative, said, "That's not what that's for." And she took the pad away. How I grieve for what that young girl learned in church that morning. Couldn't that bent out of shape woman just as easily said, "Could you draw me a picture of our baptismal font?" Or, "I'm so glad that you're in worship this morning." But it's the Sabbath, and every observant Jew then and religious person now knows that work is a no-no, work of any type. It's the Sabbath, and so why is so-and-so, why did they come to church dressed so casually? Don't they know better? It's the Sabbath, and why is that hymn being played so slowly? That doesn't happen here, by the way. It's the Sabbath, and why is that child in worship anyway? She can't get anything out of it, and she's disturbing me besides. It's the Sabbath, and so the synagogue leader is there to set things straight. People, let me remind you what you're here for. Certainly not healing. You can do that any other day of the week. And certainly not to draw on an attendance pad. And the synagogue leader is 100% correct about the Sabbath command. In Exodus 28 through 11 tells us to keep the Sabbath because God kept it on the seventh day. God stopped everything on the Sabbath. And so we too are to stop doing. But while that synagogue leader is entirely right, he still gets it entirely wrong. Because there's another reason for keeping the Sabbath. There are two different versions. I hate to tell biblical literalists this. There are two different versions of the Ten Commandments, one in Exodus and one in Leviticus. One in Deuteronomy. My apologies. Exodus and Deuteronomy. And for the fourth commandment, there is a different reason for keeping the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy 5:15, the Sabbath is not about God's rest from the work of creation, but about God's act to liberate the Hebrew slaves from their captivity in Egypt. And so God says, you are to keep the Sabbath because your ancestors went 400 years without a day off. You know, you can't go 400 years making bricks for pyramids without getting a bit bent over, both spiritually and physically. So in Deuteronomy, the Sabbath is to remind us that we're not created to become machines of production for adding value to the Egyptian gross national product. The Sabbath is to liberate us to be human again. When we have forgotten that we are more than whatever it is that we do to make a living. Sabbath is a day for us to get bent back into shape, to be reminded that we are beloved children of God. And that's why Jesus uses a different name for this crippled woman in our reading. Did you notice that? Jesus doesn't name her by what she has become, but rather by who she was created to be. Child of Abraham is what he calls her. And child of Abraham is the exact same thing as calling her a child of God. And I wonder if this woman has gone 18 years without anybody referring to her as a child of God. There's a story about a little girl who was living in a rural community. She lived in a little house, and her parents were loving enough. And from time to time, she had a good teacher at school. But this little girl also had a cleft palate. And there wasn't enough money in her growing up home to fix this defect. And by the time she was 7 years old, she'd heard the phrase, "The face only a mother could love," enough to know what that meant. And her physical infirmity was beginning to be an emotional and spiritual infirmity. And one day, her teacher needed to put all the children through some basic tests: hearing, sight, dexterity. And when it was her turn, the little girl with the cleft palate went into the classroom, set aside for the exam. And the teacher said, "Just stand over there from her desk at the far end of the room. Just stand over there. I want to test your hearing. Turn your back, face the door, and tell me what you hear me say." "Apple," the teacher said in a low voice. "Apple," the little girl repeated. "Man," said the teacher. "Man," said the girl. "Banana," banana. Okay, the teacher said, now for a sentence. And the child knew that these sentences were usually easy. She wasn't the first child to take the test that day, and she knew that she could expect something like, the sky is blue, or are your shoes brown? And so she's facing the door, looking very intently, and she hears the teacher say quite clearly, I wish you were my little girl. You know, circumstances and people and events in our lives conspire to define us as less than who God has created us to be. Sometimes it's dysfunctional. Sometimes, remember, I was a child protective services worker. It is diabolical and satanic. But if we listen closely enough to Jesus, what God is trying to tell us through him is that each and every one of us, I wish you were my child. I wish you were my child. Beloved of God, the Sabbath was created for this purpose, to bend us back into shape, not so we would become religiously uptight, but to help us stand upright. And if, like the synagogue leader, there are times when we're in worship and we're starting to feel a bit bent out of shape, know that what's really happening is that God is trying to bend us back into shape so that we can dance upright and all the way into the kingdom of heaven. Amen.